It's a very great pleasure to welcome our speaker, Professor Dark, this evening, talking about a topic which is really of quite crucial importance to anthropology, which is, as we do our fieldwork, how can we say sensible things about the past? And we've always, certainly over the last 100 years, been terribly worried about this. And last week we had a seminar from Ross Bowden where he showed, I think convincingly, that he could have very sensible information over the last 200 years. And already I think that's extremely interesting. And now we're going to think about how we might go even further back with our very distinguished speaker, who are present as an honorary professor, or visiting professor, honorary professor?
Visiting
professor in King's College London.
An actual professor, just visiting.
Exactly. Although newly retired from his chair in the University of Reading. So I think that's really enough from me. We'll do the normal thing of welcoming the speaker, and then what we'll do is we'll combine together afterwards questions from our online audience with questions from the floor. And so that means I should also say welcome to our online audience, and if you could kindly please put your questions into the Q&A box, which you'll see as part of your Zoom seminar. Then we'll have a nice accumulated list of them, which we can turn to as we have the question period beginning. So, welcome then, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. And today I'm going to talk about Beyond the Horizon, rethinking the long-term transmission of historical information. And so, which will start. Okay. Anthropological scholarship, I'm not going to read from this generally. Anthropological scholarship on oral tradition, which I'm going to call throughout just tradition. I know that's a difficult term, and I'm aware of the many pitfalls of using it, but it's going to be used in this talk as a shorthand, has been influential in the way that archaeologists, historians, and others think about the long-term transmission of remembered people, places, and of events and speech without written evidence. So, in all these fields, we have what seems to be a body of tradition, a body of oral tradition, which would, if even partly true, helpfully inform us of sometimes very distant times and places. The result of taking into account anthropological scholarship in this way is that there's become a convention, a rule, if you like, that a historical horizon for oral tradition exists at about 200 or even 150 years before the written record of that tradition. It's almost universally accepted in archaeology and history that this is the case. I've seen occasional claims for its extension to at least to as much as 500 years, but that is the exception rather than the rule. In this talk, I'm going to bring together some evidence from across the globe that these societies, diverse as they are, that have produced this non-literate tradition, can transmit information which is historically reliable or could be historically reliable in this way for much more than 200 years before the present. And I'm going to use that to suggest that we should think in a much more nuanced way about when we think of a historical horizon for traditions and if that concept is even valid at all. And so this lecture is about why I would think to question that 200 or 150 year historical horizon rule. So, why did I get interested in this? The reason is a very indirect one. I was working in an archaeological context. I'm trained as an archaeologist, historian, and to some extent as an anthropologist. But I was working in an archaeological context on Nazareth in Galilee, in what is today the modern state of Israel, and looking at the emergence of Nazareth. We see here a picture of the present Church of the Annunciation in Nazareth, the biggest church in Nazareth, but I'm told also the biggest church in the Middle East. I was working on the emergence of Nazareth as a Christian pilgrimage centre, and that pilgrimage centre came into existence in the 4th century AD, or CE if you like, and has persisted one way or another through to the present. The archaeology of Nazareth has been very little studied, and in fact, my work between 2004 and 2010 was the first modern examination of Nazareth's archaeology by a professional archaeologist in what might be called a secular context. Anybody who'd previously studied the archaeology of Nazareth had been doing so either because they were motivated by a religious cause, whether that was to prove events of the Christian Bible, prove things about Judaism, or prove that the Bible or other religious beliefs were incorrect. And none of those people who'd worked on Nazareth before were actual professional archaeologists, except people from the Israeli State Archaeological Service, the IAA, the Israel Antiquities Authority, who were doing some rescue excavations, some excavations ahead of building work in the modern city of Nazareth. So Nazareth is quite a big modern city in Galilee. It's about 60,000 people. And all that previous archaeology had not found very much about the earliest inhabitation of Nazareth, but it had found some tantalizing hints that the modern city of Nazareth was centred on what had been the ancient settlement of Nazareth. And here on the right, you see a picture of one of the underground constructed spaces, probably an underground stable, in this case, which had been found and dated to the 1st century AD. Fairly obviously, Nazareth being the hometown of Jesus of Nazareth, the 1st century, particularly the early 1st century when Jesus was there, is a key period for anybody studying Nazareth and its role in global history. In the course of my work on Nazareth, I came across the structure of a house which had been built in the 1st century, early in the 1st century, at the Sisters of Nazareth convent, a modern European convent, Christian convent, in the centre of Nazareth. And this structure on the screen here, I named Structure 1. We archaeologists are imaginative in our naming of these features. And we could date it to the early 1st century, or at least the earlier part of the 1st century. But as well as being the best preserved and the first identified house that could probably have been part of the Nazareth Jesus knew when he was living there, this building was also the focus of a Byzantine, that is to say 5th to 7th century church, built above it because the Byzantines, the Christians of the 5th to 7th centuries in this area, believed that it was the house, the very house, that Jesus, Mary and Joseph had lived in Nazareth. And earlier than the record that tells us this, which is late 7th century, in the 4th century, in about 380, there's a reference to what seems to be the same site with the same attribution. So, as an archaeologist studying Nazareth, I was immediately faced with the interesting question that could the occupants of this early 1st century house really have been remembered centuries later? And my instinct, because I'd been trained as a source critical historian and all imbued with the anthropology of oral tradition, my instinct was to say, well, of course not. Oral traditions are fluid, they are constantly being remade. Thoughts of people like David Henniger, Molly Miller, Van Sinner, and all these people flooded through my head, and I thought, out of the question. But then there was a surprise, and the surprise was that when the European nuns came to Nazareth and bought the land that the house was on, and that the later Byzantine church and its Crusader church successor was on, in 1881, they were told, it's interesting you should be buying this piece of land for your convent. It's especially apt for a convent because it was the site of a great church which had the tomb of St. Joseph, the tomb of the man called the Just. That's one of the epithets of St. Joseph in the Bible, on it long ago. Now, we know archaeologically, and from depictions of Nazareth at the time, that in 1881 or anywhere near that, there were no ruins of a church on this site. There was no written source that anyone in Nazareth might have identified that church from. And there were no depictions of the church. The church, the Crusader church, had been burnt down, absolutely burnt to the ground. We have the ashes archaeologically and the collapsed buildings to an extent that they were 4 meters under 1880s ground level. and that had happened in 1187. Now, you might say, as I thought originally, oh well, the local people who were saying this to these European nuns were just trying to be kind, or just trying to, conversely, raise the price of the land, or they were trying to tell them a tale they thought they'd like. But in fact, this is where the tomb of the just, this is the tomb we're talking about, still at the Sisters of Nazareth side. The scale is in 10 centimetres, all my scales are in 10 centimetres. The tomb of the just is an interesting thing, because we know that this tomb, which is actually too late to be the tomb of St. Joseph, was identified as the tomb of St. Joseph, not by the Byzantines, but by the Crusaders who built that church, burnt down in 1187. And we know that from one Russian language text written by a Ukrainian abbot who visited it in the 12th century. Now, that text would not have been known to people in Nazareth in 1881. And it wasn't realised that it was associated with the church, the Crusader church at the Sisters of Nazareth and that tomb, until, in fact, my own work in the early 2000s. So there was no way, from any written evidence, anything they could have seen, that local people could have said the tomb of the just was at the Sisters of Nazareth site. And I can think, and this is what got me started on this line, I can think of no way that those people could have known that, unless it was an extraordinarily lucky guess, then that tradition had been preserved in Nazareth, in the local Christian community. In 1881, Nazareth was a Christian city, for the past 700 years. And wow, there goes the historical horizon at 200 years before present, doesn't it? So I thought, yeah, this sounds a bit much to believe, though all the evidence is in favour of it. And I'm a kind of archaeologist who's led by the evidence, and historian for that matter, who's led by the evidence, but not by my preconceptions. Yeah, that's fascinating. So, are there any other examples of this? I then was working up around the Sea of Galilee in the north of what is today the modern state of Israel. This is one of the sites around the Sea of Galilee. This is a place called Capernaum. Those of you who are familiar with the normal English pronunciation of this, as proffered in many churches across England, it's this place that people often call Capernaum, but it actually was called Capernaum. This was one of several pilgrimage centres, again of the Byzantine period. Now, the standard work on these, when I started archaeological research around the shores of the Sea of Galilee, many of them are around the shores of the Sea of Galilee, was in fact by my closest colleague today at King's College London, Professor Joan Taylor, who had argued quite convincingly that they originated in the 4th century AD CE and had come forward from that. However, looking at them archaeologically, I couldn't help but notice that those that said this pilgrimage site focuses on a 1st century building or a 1st century tomb did have a 1st century building or a 1st century tomb underneath the Byzantine church built centuries later. Those that said they weren't didn't. So this is not the best example actually, but it's a visible example, so I put it on the screen to help you. This is at Capernaum, which is why I showed you the picture of Capernaum before. This is a Byzantine octagonal church. You can see the concentric octagons. You can see earlier dry stone walls. The central octagon, where the altar would be, is bang inside the room, one of the rooms of a 1st century house. A 1st century house that wasn't visible when this church was built, nor were any of the other 1st century things. So again, you have 5th to 7th century churches dedicated to 1st century events on 1st century sites. But in some of those cases, how did they know they were there? They were again either extraordinarily lucky, or they knew something we don't, and something that despite all the textual material available for, bear in mind, the Roman period in the highly literate Eastern Mediterranean, despite that, it's not there in any of the texts. Which is why, of course, Joan thought they were 4th century sites. She was completely right in one respect, but this archaeological evidence shows that they were indeed of 1st century sites. So this is not quite as extreme as the Crusader Church example at Nazareth, but it's still 304 to 400 years of preservation outside of anything we know about. So of course there are two choices. There are either lost texts, which would be fascinating if there were, because they would have to be lost texts detailing the specific details, topographical details of where Jesus and the apostles did miracles and things like that. It'd be incredible if those once existed. Or they knew from a tradition preserved in the villages which have a continuous history about where those buildings were. So, for example, that church you've just seen at Capernaum was on the site that was said to be St. Peter's house at Capernaum. Now, the Bible tells us St. Peter had a house at Capernaum, but not where it was. And we know that house was identified with St. Peter because it's got things like inscriptions in graffiti over the walls talking about St. Peter. This, by the way, is just the cave at the Sisters of Nazareth. One of the ways these sites were marked out, as anyone who came to my RAI Myers lecture a few years ago will know, was they have artificial caves dug at them in the pre-Constantinian period, in the period when Christianity was illegal in the Roman Empire. So we have several examples here, not just one, in these two case studies, of what seemed to be absolutely firm contradictions to the 200-year rule, so to speak. Now, naturally, having realised this, I looked around the world and at bits of archaeology and history and anthropology I was familiar with, especially, to see if anybody else was coming up with this kind of information. And, well, I've worked on Britain, I've worked on the Middle East, but I have, though I've never written on it, I have a long-standing personal interest in the archaeology and anthropology of the Pacific, Australia and the Pacific Islands particularly. And that's, as we were talking about just conversationally, just before the lecture, because my family are substantially Australian. I'm British, but my wider family. And in fact, Australian archaeologists and American archaeologists and indigenous archaeologists from the Pacific have identified a whole series of correlations between volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, which I hope I've spelt right there, and earthquakes with oral traditions. Whether it's in Alaska, British Columbia, the Pacific Islands, Indonesia, just and down into Australia, as far south as Tasmania. And that's just the examples that I've found out about and that I know about. There are doubtless many more. I haven't, for example, looked at yet the New Zealand examples, if any, and other examples from East Asia. And yes, they have found these things, but they have also found what seem to be chronologies that are far longer than my 300 to 700 years, going back 1,000 or even thousands of years. Now, of course, in those particular examples, we have the danger, if you like, of contamination of oral tradition by later information, later retellings. People, I think it was David Henniger, who in a paper, I think it was in 2009, pointed out all the different ways that these traditions or stories could become affected or distorted or incorporated into narratives derived from modern science, from historical sources, from, funnily enough, the work of archaeologists and anthropologists talking to local people. So it is slightly more problematical there, but on the face of it, there is this very extensive body of similar information from the Pacific. I can identify, I think it's about now 50 case studies. That's an awful lot to be just chance or just contamination of the oral tradition. Of course, most controversially, though fascinatingly, there's the work, I'm sure you know it, so some people out there watching this online certainly know it, the work of Patrick Nunn and his collaborators on sea level change in Australia. Nunn and his colleagues have identified 34 sites. Here, courtesy of Patrick, is his latest map of where they all are. 34 sites around the coast of Australia where it seems local oral tradition had preserved memories of dramatic sea level change. But as he and his colleagues have pointed out, if that is true, that would have to be on a whole different magnitude of timescale, tens of thousands of years. Oh, whoops. Now, one might say, is it possible that coastal communities routinely talk about the time at which the sea was part of the land in a mythological or imaginative way? And that could be a critique of that. But again, there are an awful lot of these examples to just be explained away. And why I've got a map now of the world is to illustrate to you, and I haven't got a pointer I can use here, but we now have seen that there are possible examples from Alaska and British Columbia up in the northwest, the Pacific Northwest of the Americas, right the way across the Pacific Ocean, including Hawaii, down to Australia and right the way around the Australian coast, and at least as far west as Indonesia. This seems a tremendous number of case studies suggestive of this kind of transmission, even if some of them turn out to be false leads, some of them turn out to fall into Henniger's various pitfalls. Of course, members of the RAI will remember a very, I think, seminal lecture by Francis and Howard Morphy on their work in Arnhem Land, where they've been able to reconstruct through toponyms, through place names, a previous coastline which geology, or strictly speaking, I think geomorphology, shows existed, but existed 3,000 years ago. Remembered in those toponyms by the local people of the area. Again, how can this be chance? How can a pattern of toponyms indicating a coastline correlated with modern geological knowledge of what that coastline was 3,000 years ago be purely a matter of chance? This is a coastline picture of Arnhem Land. So, I don't know about you, but I find the Morphy's work pretty convincing, and it goes alongside those other many examples from the Pacific, the examples I've told you about from the Middle East. Now, Patrick Nunn and his collaborators, who vary from paper to paper, which is why I'm putting it like that, have also extended their work on sea level change to other parts of the world, including Northwest Europe, and as part of that, including Britain. So, for example, they've looked at oral traditions of sea level change and geological evidence for sea level change. He's a geologist, by the way, in the Hebrides in Scotland. This is a picture of the Hebrides, and found a correlation there also. Of course, when we talk about sea level change in Britain, there's a fascinating example here in what we call the Scilly Isles off the coast of Cornwall. A medieval legend not recorded by before the 12th century AD says the Scilly Isles were once one island. And there's archaeological evidence under the sea for farming in those areas between what currently, and were in the Middle Ages, separate islands. How on earth did they know this in the 12th century when it was written down? Because it hadn't been the case as this animation, and this is not my own work of fantasy. This is the product of a major multi-year research project by no other than Historic England, the state archaeological body for England. So this is not a work of fantasy. This is an illustration of our best picture, using current science, of sea level change in the Scilly Isles, or as the legend calls it, the lost land of Lyonesse. You don't have to be all mysterious and legendary about it to recognise that what was being said about the Scilly Isles in the 12th century actually happened. It may not have happened in all the embroidering of, storytelling. I mean, there's a story that a man rode ahead of the waves on a horse and saved himself and his family. That need not be true, probably isn't true, but these are subsidiary tales that get attached in the retelling over centuries of a story. The core, and I know we don't like to say about the core of truth, or a credible core of an oral tradition, but here there does seem to be a way of a context in which you can talk about that. The core is that there was one Scilly Isle, and now, and in the 12th century, there were many. Elsewhere in Britain, there are other examples of lost islands and islands that are said to have been changed in local stories recorded in the Middle Ages. Now, my interest in medieval tales as part of this is simply because they are not going to be contaminated by modern science. They are not going to be contaminated by archaeologists or anthropologists talking to our informants. They get out of David Henniger's problems in the Pacific. So, for example, when medieval story tells us that there was a lost island in Cardigan Bay, seen here, it was only a couple of years ago that geologists and historians recognised that there was actually a good case for there being a lost island in Cardigan Bay, not least because it's shown on an otherwise accurate medieval depiction of Cardigan Bay. But that legend has persisted as a story up until the 19th, 20th, and in our case, 21st centuries. I know it's not as good evidence as some of the other ones, but it shows how common this kind of thing may be when we start looking at it. Of course, in Britain, we tend to think that there are no stories of extreme antiquity that could possibly be true. After all, there's no recollection of Roman towns in any kind of medieval or early modern storytelling. Even here at Wroxeter, where there's a Welsh epic poem about a prince called Cynthillan. That name I've written on the screen is pronounced Cynthillan, by the way. Even at Wroxeter, despite its big ruins, largest piece of Roman masonry surviving in Britain, and the Welsh epic, medieval epic set in the area, there's no reference to what was one of the biggest Roman towns. Likewise, in the 10th century Anglo-Saxon poem, The Ruin, the ruins of Roman Bath are described in wholly mythological terms. The giants built them and so forth. So, obviously, in Britain, we don't expect this sort of thing, but we would be wrong. And we wouldn't be wrong because Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 10th, 12th century has a tale about the construction of Stonehenge, which from time to time, my prehistoric colleagues, my colleagues who are prehistorians, have tried to correlate with the archaeological version of the story of the construction of Stonehenge. It doesn't really correlate very well. But that same Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote a medieval bestseller in the late 12th century called The History of the Kings of Britain, its modern translation into English is seen on one side of this slide, does record some interesting information among the pseudo-historical mess that is most of the history of the kings of Britain, that does relate to earlier stories about places in Britain. Now, the history of kings of Britain, for those who don't know, is famous because it popularised the legend of King Arthur, about whom presumably everybody knows in this audience. And the legend of King Arthur had been growing since the early 9th century, when it was first set out, if you like, in a book called Historia Britonum, which we see a page of on the other side of this slide. Both the History of the Kings of Britain and Historia Britonum are pseudo-histories. They're not to be taken as real historical narratives, but both might incorporate earlier oral traditions. In fact, Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain was analysed in exactly that light by the leading expert on Cornish place names and on early Cornish history, Oliver Pardle, now retired, previously at Cambridge and before that at the Institute of Cornish Studies in Truro. Oliver pointed out that in the History of the Kings of Britain, Geoffrey of Monmouth seems to draw on Cornish folklore, in other words, Cornish folklore available in the 12th century, that said Tintagel, this rocky, eroded headland of the Cornish coast, was once the fortress of the kings of southwest Britain. And it was that in the 6th century. Or possibly he might have been referring to the late 5th century. Archaeology from the 1930s onwards has shown that Tintagel Head here, was a fortress of incredibly well-connected, almost certainly royal people, kings, ruling over what must have been the southwest of Britain. In other words, Cornish folklore in the 12th century, and this is Oliver Pardle's argument, not mine, got it right about 6th century Tintagel. You don't have to believe that Arthur was born there or anything like that to realise that when Geoffrey drew on southwestern British oral tradition, that tradition remembered the court of the kings of southwest Britain getting not only where it was, but when it was right. Now, I've been doing an archaeological project on the hinterland of Tintagel for the last 5 years. And one of the interesting things is how little King Arthur or any of the other legendary associations of Tintagel are reflected in the countryside outside Tintagel, except at a place called Bassini Mound. Bassini Mound is it's on the left by that grey building. That grey building is actually a Christian chapel. Bassini Mound is an artificial mound, usually in the past interpreted as a Norman Motte and Bailey castle, the castle being on a big artificial mound, surrounded by a settlement a defended settlement on a lower level. Our work has shown that whatever Bassini Mound is not a Motte and Bailey castle. In fact, the best interpretation archaeologically for what it is an assembly mound. These were common on the Atlantic coast of Britain from Scotland to Wales, quite possibly in Cornwall, and also in Ireland in the same period that we're talking about the royal site being on Tintagel Head. They're associated with kings, associated with popular gatherings, things like the inauguration of kings or the proclamation of laws. here we see an illustration of one being used for exactly that purpose in Ireland in the Middle Ages. Bassini Mound may well have been an inauguration mound, an assembly mound. It's the only place with an Arthurian association in the immediate hinterland of Tintagel, a long-standing association. Strangely enough, it's associated with gathering together of the knights of King Arthur. Whether that's true, I mean, I don't mean the knights of King Arthur. King Arthur would certainly have had no knights if he really existed in the 6th century, but whether it was exactly for those sort of assembly purposes, it's interesting that the only place with those associations is the place that they might be real, might be historically accurate. Conversely, where a modern legend derived from a misreading of this inscription at a place called Slaughter-Bridge, at a place called Slaughter-Bridge, where there's this thing called the Slaughter-Bridge stone. It's a 6th century Latin inscribed tombstone, where this has misreading this stone has led to a fake post-17th century association with the 6th century legend of Arthur. We can tell from excavation there is nothing of that date around the stone. So where we have a potentially genuine association at Tintagel Head with 6th century kings, it's confirmed. Where we have an association which we know is made up or a mistake in later centuries, there's nothing there. That's as close as I can get to a test case for the opposite. When we look at the rest of Cornwall, we have legendary associations with sites which, strangely, were occupied in this period, such as St Michael's Mount, dated in part to the relevant period. But in the 5th and 7th centuries, Western British settlements are notoriously difficult to locate. Very, very few of them get found even in a decade of modern archaeological research. High status settlements of this date can often be dated by, not always, but often be dated by the presence of imported Byzantine pottery, such as these amphorae you can see on the left of the slide, or diagnostic, characteristically 5th to 7th century metalwork, such as this penannular brooch on the right of the slide. Now, looking at Cornwall in general, and indeed in southwest Britain in general, we have a series of sites which mostly Arthurian, but not always Arthurian, legends associate with being the sites where kings of the 6th century held court, such as Killibery Rings here, where occupation can be dated by pottery of that type I was showing you. In Somerset, South Cadbury Castle, a hill fort sometimes even today known as Cadbury Camelot, where at least since the 14th century, it was said that 6th century rulers dwelt, again associating this with Arthur, hence the Camelot association. When excavated in the 1960s and early 70s, South Cadbury Castle proved to be what is still the biggest hill fort of the late 5th to 7th centuries known to us archaeologically in Britain. So, in other words, regardless of all the Arthurian gloss, if you took that statement as being a king lived there in the 6th century, it's true, at least so far as we can see from archaeology. And this is true of a whole series of sites with legendary associations, connecting them with 6th century figures, whether kings or saints. Nowhere more so than at Glastonbury. Here we see Glastonbury Tor. Well known, of course, for the Glastonbury Festival today, but a major medieval pilgrimage site at Glastonbury Abbey and deeply associated with the Arthurian legend. Assorted legends say that there was a 6th century settlement on the Glastonbury Tor. Archaeology shows there was. These are medieval legends. A medieval legend says there was a 6th century settlement, a monastery, at Glastonbury Abbey. Archaeology shows there was a 6th century settlement there. Archaeology also shows, if you might say, these are prominent local features in the Middle Ages. Archaeology shows that there was a 6th century religious site at a tiny chapel called Beckery Chapel, one of a constellation of tiny chapels in the area. And that's the one which has legendary associations with having been founded in the 6th century. In fact, 3 out of the 4 locations in the Glastonbury area that can be shown to be sites occupied in the 6th century have legendary associations. And none of the sites which can be shown to have nothing of that date have similar associations. So much for secular rulers. Then we come to saints. Now, reinterpretation of the 240 inscribed stones, Latin inscribed stones, you've already seen one, from Western Britain, has shown that they are likely to have been the memorials to saints rather than secular individuals. And as anybody who's visited the western or north of Britain will know, or in fact Ireland, there are a myriad of local so-called Celtic saints to whom churches are dedicated. Time and time again, those churches with so-called Celtic dedications are shown to be at or near sites which were used in the 5th to 7th centuries, when the medieval legends say there was an age of saints to which all these dedications belong. No more evidence is needed, I think, than when we consider the so-called children of Brychan. Brychan was a legendary, possibly historical, Welsh king of the 6th century, well, the late 5th and 6th century. He had numerous children, it's said in medieval legend, and they all became saints, many of them going to Cornwall and Devon to convert the local peoples, or maybe in a different version, to spread monastic life among the local peoples. One of these examples of these saints who had very distinctive names is St Endelion. And in St Endelion parish, we see this stone, the St Endelion stone. It's an example of one of these Latin inscribed stones. And bear in mind, these Welsh saints that are the children of Brychan, recorded first in the 10th century, but referring to the 5th and early 6th century, are recorded in Wales. This is in Cornwall. What does this inscription say? So-and-so, child of Brychan, Brocagnes. That's the 6th century version of Brychan. And now we think that these memorials are all associated with the cult of saints. Coming to Wales, how much time have I got left? Coming to Wales, the recent Oxford Atlas of British hill forts lists 535 hill forts in Wales. Now, about 20 of them have stories associating them with the 5th and 7th centuries. Now, AD. Now, it's hard to be more exact, because what you call a story of that day, associating with a hill fort of that date with a legendary figure or a named figure, is difficult sometimes to ascertain. But let's say 20. Very, very few Welsh hill forts are dated to the 5th and 7th centuries. 12, in fact. Again, you could play about with that number, but that's approximately right. Half of which, 6, are among the 20 with legendary associations of that date. Now, you are ascribing them to that date. Now, that's out of the 535. Not all of them have been excavated, but many Welsh hill forts have been excavated. And the problem of finding sites of the 5th and 7th centuries is one of the big research questions of Welsh archaeology. Yet, of the 20 sites with legendary associations, you dig half of them. Well, you dig 6 of them, a third, roughly, and they turn out to be actually occupied in this period. Again, is it just chance? Maybe it is, but I think this is very unlikely. I haven't got time to go into it in detail, but this kind of thing extends into North Britain. A poem written down in the 13th century, but describing events that seem to be in the 7th century, called Y Gododdin, the longest of the extant Celtic British poems, sometimes called the earliest Scottish poem, but that's a misnomer because it's in the Brittonic language, the language of the Western Britons, describes a royal fortress on what is almost certainly Castle Rock, Edinburgh. That was not visible, that there was nothing of that date visible when that poem was written down in the 13th century. excavations have shown that there was occupation of that date on Castle Rock, almost certainly as a hill fort, which are otherwise associated with royal sites in this period. Godolphin also has what seems to be an earlier substratum of oral tradition, in which it describes warriors dressed almost exactly like this bloke, who is a statue from Gaul, centuries earlier, depicting a Celtic warrior, a Gaul, the type of person who fought the Romans when they conquered Gaul. And in particular, Godolphin talks about how the heroes wear torques, metal necklaces, neck rings, like this man does. The point is that even if Godolphin was first written down in the 7th century, which we don't know, we have it in a 13th century version, though its language is archaic. Even if it was written down then, torques hadn't been produced, we know archaeologically, since the 2nd century. How on earth did someone in the 13th century know about these and know about their use? They're not statues like that in Scotland, I can tell you, or in North Wales, where the 13th century manuscript was written. Other material in this corpus seems to likewise refer to heroes in chariots. Nobody had used a chariot in British warfare since at least the 6th century. And now we come on to the really juicy stuff. The Welsh epic poem, or group of poems, epic stories, or group of stories, called the Mabinogion, and the Welsh triads, a series of 3 things that are linked to make a point, like the 3 unbeatable heroes, or the 3 greedy men, that sort of thing. And it will have a little bit about them. They're meant to have been reminders, mnemonics for Welsh poets, bards in the Middle Ages. But both the Mabinogion, this group of stories, very, very legendary, mythical type of medieval stories. Hard to explain. I can talk about them afterwards if you want. And the triads talk about a hero, an anti-hero, a principal figure called Manawydan. Manawydan, the leading, or one of the leading historians of the Celtic languages alive, John Cook. He will be known to archaeologists in the audience here and online as the same John Cook who's written a couple of books recently with Barry Cunliffe, the famous Iron Age archaeologist. John Cook, has identified Manawydan as a later Welsh version of the name Mandubracius. Now, the Mabinogion and the Welsh triads are fully medieval. Late 11th century at earliest. 12th century, in the case of the Mabinogion, probably. Now, Mandubracius is an interesting name, as there is a Mandubracius in Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. and he is involved in the Roman incursion into southeast England, as it is now, in the lands which were ruled by two British kingdoms, indigenous, as it were, British kingdoms called the Catulluni and the Trinovantes. And Mandubracius is a king of the Trinovantes in Caesar's Gallic War. Now, whether or not Caesar's Gallic War was known in northwest Wales, where the Mabinogion and the Welsh triads were written down, is extremely debatable, some would say very unlikely. But even if it was, Manawydan is associated with southeast England, as it now is, the Trinovantes, and the disgrace of having let the Romans into Britain. His story in the Mabinogion is one of bad kingship. In the Welsh triads, he was an example of a bad king, one of the three bad kings. The thing is that the Mabinogion story of Manawydan contains quite a bit of material, if you strip aside the legendary aspects, which is not in Caesar's Gallic Wars. It names other rulers of southeast England, only known to us today through Iron Age coins found in southeast England, not in Wales, and therefore not conceivably known to the people who wrote the Mabinogion. More so, we read in the Mabinogion that Manawydan, Mandubracius, is associated with two things. He's associated with wheat and agricultural prosperity, and he is associated with a horse. Well, horses, but a specific horse. And when we look at the coins, the Iron Age coins, the ones not found in Wales, that the writer of the Mabinogion could not have known about, dating from the same time as Mandubracius, from the same kingdom, presumably minted for Mandubracius, we find we find this. On one side, a sheaf of wheat, and on the other side, a horse. So the symbols of Manawydan are a sheaf, are wheat and a horse. The Iron Age coins of this Iron Age coin of Mandubracius's kingdom could not have been known to the people who wrote that. That is from the 1st century BC, and the Mabinogion and the triads talking about Manawydan are from the 12th century, the late 11th and 12th century. So I think John Cook has a good argument here that something was preserved outside any source known to us, any written source known to us, of the late Iron Age in medieval North Wales. Of course, this brings to mind decades of research by scholars of Celtic literature and history on the Ulster cycle in Ireland, a so-called window on the Iron Age, which, although not being recorded in an earlier than 8th century form, seems to reflect all sorts of characteristics we know: chariot fighting, druids, all kind of stuff, that we know from the European Iron Age and from the classical accounts of the European Iron Age. James Mallory, in particular, and other scholars have shown how the Ulster cycle is layered in different identifiable ways of structuring the story as we have it today in its later form. But among those layers are, like in Igododin, some which would seem centuries older than the text we have. And in the case of the Ulster cycle, we can actually trace back references to the stories, but not the actual full stories, into the period in which Christianity was present in Ireland, and so Latin literacy was present. And now we come to my penultimate example, you will be pleased to hear, but one of the most bizarre. And that is the Annals of the Four Masters. Again, this is not my piece of work, like the Manawi Den was John Cook's. When a very well-respected Irish archaeologist called Richard Warner and a very well-respected Irish dendrochronologist called Mike Bailey came to look at the Annals of the Four Masters, an early 17th century compilation of Irish annual lists of events, purportedly going back to thousands of years BC and up to the early 17th century. They found a really bizarre and, in the true sense of the word, remarkable correlation. If you take these 8 dates assigned by the Annals of the Four Masters, this is in reference to Warner's paper reporting this. If you take these 8 dates in the Annals of the Four Masters, they correlate, as Warner and Bailey first noted in 1990, I kid you not, with archaeological and dendrochronological dates for similar things, presumably the same things, in the modern scientific record. Volcanic disaster, referenced by dendrochronology. First introduction of gold, evidenced by datable archaeological material. Another period of volcanic disaster, a second introduction of gold. Another volcanic introduction, the construction of the great Irish ceremonial centre of Navan. That site, incidentally, crops up in the Ulster cycle. The Ulster cycle talks about royal ceremonial centres focused on a huge building, usually mistranslated from the Old Irish as a hostel. Strangely enough, the biggest thing in Iron Age Navan is a huge circular building. And then volcanic disaster again, and then the construction of a trackway. And there is what might be the same trackway, known archaeologically, dated 148, whereas the annals date what could be the same trackway, 142 to 116. So what Warner and Bailey suggest, and that, you know, I think now, in the light of all this, we can't just dismiss out of hand, is that whoever compiled the source that the Annals of the Four Masters got this from knew something genuinely about what we would normally call Irish prehistory. And of course, if so, if all this that I'm talking about is so, it challenges the whole notion of prehistory. It challenges what we think of as being the recorded past. Because the recorded past may be hundreds, possibly thousands of years earlier than we've been accustomed to thinking. And it doesn't end there, but I don't have enough time to get into many other examples. There are some which are possible, like the Lever Gavela, the Book of Conquests, an Irish text which purports to show in a mythological phraseology, the different dated waves of conquest that affected Irish history, Irish prehistory, we would normally say. It's normally these days dismissed as complete legend. As I say, in the context of this sort of evidence, maybe it isn't, or maybe it's only partly legend. And there are examples of what I'm talking about, the correlation of archaeological, historical, or geological information with tradition, oral tradition, recorded mostly in the pre-modern period, but some of it in the modern period for the first time, coming up all the time. While I've been setting up this, there's been an interesting one at Leicester Cathedral. Leicester Cathedral, seen here, 20th century cathedral, made out, so to speak, of a medieval parish church. Seen here. That church was built in the 12th century. By the 19th century, there was a legend that it stood on the site of a Roman temple. Now, one might think, as I would have thought, oh, well, they're always saying this about English parish churches. They're always saying it stood on the site of a pagan temple. It's just a kind of topos of English ecclesiastical story. Except when they built the 19th century church, they found a Roman building under the medieval church. Now, again, I would have said before the last few years, oh, well, there are Roman buildings under a lot of English parish churches. It's interesting for different reasons, but that doesn't prove anything. The recent rescue excavation of Leicester Cathedral showed that there was indeed a Roman shrine under it. That legend is not recorded before the 19th century. Is it really a legend that has come through the Middle Ages? I mean, the obvious point of origin would be when they built the 12th century church. They might have found statues, inscriptions, or whatever. I'm not suggesting it goes back to Roman Britain. But on the other hand, it could well be another 700-year duration of a story. So, what do these things, I'm coming to an end, what do these things have in common? Well, the stories that seem to last longest are associated with locations. And that's not surprising, since literally the classical period, people have been talking about a theory of loci, places, as a form of remembering events or people in association with place. The story is often holding a didactic message, telling a lesson like Manoidan, a bad kingship, or associated with an exceptional person, like Jesus and the apostles in the Middle East. Of course, the context is often embellished. There are subsidiary stories, there are little fantastical additions, and they're often recast in contemporary setting, sometimes several times, like watching Shakespeare's Cymbeline in modern dress, or Kenneth Branagh's recent King Lear told as a Neolithic tale. But the statements of the basic points seem to be the longest preserved. A ruler lived there in the 6th century. This volcano erupted at a certain specific time. And to believe in the possibility of oral tradition transmitting information for such long periods of time doesn't mean to say we should ignore all the lessons learnt from previous studies. Things are reworked, they're made to fit in with contemporary politics, ideologies, values, and events. And there are supposedly long-lasting traditions that are probably completely false. There are some traditions of all sorts that are entirely fictitious. Topographical associations can be made up or just misremembered. And all traditions, so to speak, of the same type don't transform over time in the same ways, nor are all oral traditions of the same type. Ruth Finnegan showed that as early as 1970, we shouldn't think of these traditions as being all of the same thing. And of course, we can't treat what we would consider to be pseudo-historical works, like Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, on other grounds, what we would consider on other grounds as pseudo-historical, as historically true, just because they contain, or should I say repeat, traditions, oral traditions, that may themselves be in that detail correct. But what all of these examples also have in common are there are institutional systems well studied in the Middle East, in what might be called the Holy Land, well studied in the Pacific Islands, for example, and in Australia, and also among the Celtic-speaking peoples of Britain and Ireland in the Middle Ages, that try to ensure that oral transmission is accurate. People have studied all of these things elsewhere, and I don't need to rehearse them now. An alternative is we could envisage much greater encoding in symbols or unrecognised literacies than we have hitherto imagined. Perhaps as pictograms and ideograms. I'm thinking, for example, of the carvings on Australian trees. If they'd existed on oak trees or whatever in Britain, we would have none of them from the sort of periods, or few of them, from the sort of periods that I've been talking about. And an example of a literacy which I think would miss if we didn't have the contextual information to understand it is in fact provided by evidence from the very periods that I've been talking about in Britain and Ireland, in the Ogham, or Ogom, to use the actual Old Irish word for it, script. It's just lines of different lengths, and some of them are sloping. It's like Dark Age Morse code. If we didn't know the language behind it, if we didn't know it was meant to be a script and had parallel texts on some inscriptions written in Ogham in Latin, and if we didn't know it was structured according to one of the late Roman grammars, it came out of, almost certainly, out of either an ecclesiastical or Roman military context. I favour the ecclesiastical context, but that's neither here nor there for this point. We would not, I think, recognise it as necessarily a form of writing. Maybe some of the things we dismiss as symbols, we dismiss as decoration on prehistoric artefacts are pictograms or ideograms or the equivalent in a different way of Ogham. And I would say, as a piece of direct evidence for that, it's become increasingly clear over the last 30 years that the Pictish inscribed stones, again broadly of this period I've been talking about, found in Scotland, are pictograms of actual information-rich messages, whereas they were once thought to be just squiggly symbolic designs. And on that note, I shall give you my copyright information and say thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you for a fascinating, thoroughly coherent and detailed overview of your various evidence, which I, for one, enjoyed enormously. I think that treated correctly, I think this is a fascinating scene of inquiry, and I'm so pleased that this is, as you quite rightly remind me, this is the third lecture we've had on this broad theme. If we include the one by the Morphes as well. So that really is a very exciting vein for us to come and explore in the future, and I'm very grateful to you that you've opened it up for us in this remarkably convincing, I think, way. Now, we have some time for questions, and I'd like to begin with the floor, so please.
Very interesting, thank you very much. And I'm intrigued about how the a particular time could be transmitted through through time. So those examples that you had of the annals of whatever it was.
The Four Masters.
That's it. So, you know, you had a date there, effectively. The story, as it were, is of something at a particular time, which was so far back in time that you can't just, well, it's not yesterday or last month, it's, or, you know, your great-grandfather's age, it's even longer ago. So I was wondering how time would be transmitted.
Well, they do it in the Irish annals, usually in accordance with genealogies, family trees of kings. And so they say, in the time of King such and such. Now, of course, as many scholars, I would single out David Dunville, the famous historian, as being the key figure to read here, have highlighted genealogies, and king lists especially, are frequently manipulated. Kings are left out, kings are added in, they're reworked for political purposes, they're sometimes reworked for religious purposes and other reasons. So they're not the most reliable of chronological systems, but they are a possible chronological system. And I think we find that also in some Pacific examples, where some of the Pacific events that scholars like Patrick Kirsch have been keen to correlate with oral traditions are correlated in terms of date by such and such happened in the time of.
Right. So
Just like we would say, something like, in the time of King John, the Magna Carta was signed in the time of King John.
And that would also work at the family level, because in Wales, for example, where historically you'd be known as with your lineage, you know, the surname you were at, somebody at, son of, so you know, if you're male at least, you know your lineage for over very many generations.
Yeah, and some of these societies we're talking about, whether in the Pacific or in the Celtic-speaking world, in the Middle Ages and earlier, they are extremely concerned with genealogy on a general societal basis. It is a mainstay of social organisation. You know, in this context, I have to say, kinship really is at the core in those societies. So that's one way. Of course, my colleagues who study prehistory, especially, have long considered what calendars or forms of calendrical reckoning people could have had back into the Neolithic period and so forth, if only to structure things like the farming year and various festivals that might have been associated with it. So the idea of people in 100 or even 1000 BCE having calendrical systems by which they could calculate the year, aside from king lists and family genealogies, is not necessarily a wacky one. It may well yet to be proved, but how much about our standard view of, I don't know, the Bronze Age, could we really say was proved?
So another question, if I may, on the sea level one, and I'm coming from the position of being very receptive to the idea that we communicate stories over very long periods of time than others might think. But I remember as a very young child in West Wales being shown trees when the sand had come out, and seeing where trees had once stood because they were revealed under the sand, and then of course the sand comes back in again. So I could transmit that story from time onwards.
Exactly.
Yes, that there was the land was under was once, trees once grew where we now see sea. So therefore, with stories such as that, factually it's correct, but the point of the story, but the start of the story was much later.
Absolutely, and this is why, to me, although I value the work of our colleagues who've worked on sea level change and think it's extremely interesting, I think the most convincing examples aren't the sea level ones. I think, in fact, I was going to speak about that various thing when I showed the slide of Cardigan Bay. In fact, we'll go back to the slide of Cardigan Bay, and I was going to point out that you can see the stumps of the trees, and in fact, as you will probably know, on Borth Beach at low tide, you can see a whole forest of fallen trees in, at Borth by Aberystwyth, a beach I know very well indeed. And so, yes, it is really possible that those sort of submerged natural or human landscapes lead to some, at least, of the sea level change ones. I don't think that can explain them all, but it could explain some of them, maybe even many of them. But that wouldn't affect, for example, the Morphis toponym one. That really is, I think, very, very convincing.
Any more questions from you? I'd like to ask a question, sir. People looking very thoughtful.
What I would say about, I was a bit surprised by this 150, 200 year maximum, because there's a legal term which is time immemorial, which I know from sort of archival stuff, it is generally referred to as time out of mind. And it doesn't mean forever. It actually is a statute like the statute of Richard II, I think. Which I always have to look it up. And basically, that is a sort of year zero, that if you could demonstrate that some of your local customs went back to that point, then those customs held or were respected. And I've seen that in 16th and 17th century documents. So that's way more than 200 years.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, well, indeed, in the 16th and 17th centuries, what I'm saying would have been considered to be standard knowledge, that you could reach back for 1,000 years or more. But modern scholarship, since at least the 1970s, this was orthodoxy when I was taught it, which was not as early as that, was and is that there's people give different exact cut-off points, but it's usually said to be a 200-year historical horizon. In fact, I have always believed this, having been shown examples of where it is true, and read, the standard works on oral tradition. I've always believed this in my adult life until I came across this evidence, to the extent that in the year 2000, I wrote a book in which, in about half of the last chapter, I analysed the end of Roman Britain in terms of what people could have remembered in 200-year durations. So, in a sense, I show that correlates to some extent with the archaeology of how Roman things were by 600 years after the end of Roman Britain. They weren't Roman at all. But the whole point that I'm trying to make is that this modern scholarly convention seems to me to be ill-founded. It's almost sort of true to say something that I would mark down a student for writing in their essays. It's sort of true.
Yeah, it's making me think, because again, in psychotherapeutic circles, they say that trauma can be inherited across multiple generations. There's a lot of evidence to show that, but that it peters out, unless it's repeated for some reason. It peters out after 7 generations, which is almost 200 years, isn't it? Either side of thereabouts.
Exactly.
And I'm just thinking, has this figure of 7 generations come from the same?
It could have done. What I was taught it had come from was comparing oral tradition in Africa and the Balkans with historical information from written texts. That I can remember being taught that as an undergraduate, as just a fact. And I've seen that represented as a fact in many, many places. In fact, the only recent earlier date I've seen in conventional archaeological and historical scholarship is in Mike Parker Pearson's article on could the Geoffrey of Monmouth description of the origin of the Stonehenge stones in Ireland be historically accurate. And he says, and it's not referenced, I don't know where he's got it from, maybe it's referenced to one of his other articles or papers, I don't know, but I couldn't chase it up. He says it's sometimes considered that 500 years is a threshold. I've generally found that way more than most professional historians or archaeologists, and I think anthropologists are willing to countenance. So that would be consistent with that, and indeed with my answer there.
Yes, well, I'm just also to get to the 2 online questions. The people have been waiting so patiently, so thank you very much. But by the way, inter alia, I can't get past 1900 in my fieldwork area. I mean, I've tried for years. But basically, that's it, 120 years is your absolute maximum. And so I suppose it depends what kind of society, partly, which we could get onto if we had time. But Benedict Singleton says that he finds what you say convincing, but he says, how does one then avoid the misapprehension that every bit of folklore is an ancient memory? I'm thinking of the desire for every English folk song to contain remnants of pre-Christian culture. And he says, well, perhaps corroborative evidence, therefore, is helpful. So he's worried about going too far.
Absolutely. Yes. He should be. That's what I said on that slide. I'm coming back to it. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater on a century of scholarship on oral tradition. We should be doing all the things that Henniger and Ruth Finnegan and people like that have recommended. And historically, we should be doing Dumbvillian source criticism like he did with the royal lists. Absolutely. Cross-questioning the witness, a historian memorably wrote in a subheading for an article, I think. But it was a good way of looking at it. We should be critical and seek corroboration. But when we have corroboration, I don't think we should be saying, "Oh no, that's impossible," because that's what I think most people would have done, and that's what I would have probably done.
I mean, there are societies and societies. I mean, maybe if we do dissolve the sharp boundary between literate and non-literate literate societies, which is what anthropology was built on, modern social anthropology was built on, then perhaps we can distinguish more. I was very struck by the fact that Ian Hodder, in one of his analysis at Chateauvieux, talked about memory houses to avoid talking about shrines. We could even talk about, as it were, memory societies. Whether they construct themselves in such a way that they have much better mechanisms for the transmission of all history.
Oh, absolutely. Well, this is again what I was talking about with this slide. I think there are particular societies where this is facilitated, not necessarily necessitated, or that in other societies this is impossible, but there are societies which have the institutional structure, whether they're the Celtic bards or Aboriginal dreaming.
I mean, I remember going to a lecture by Gary Seaman, who worked in Chinese villages, rural ones, where there's no strong literate tradition, but he was absolutely convinced that you could go back dozens of generations. Because of the way that they transmitted this kind of genealogical knowledge, and of course Alan McFarlane has similar points to make with regard to his field work. But there's one more question here, a written one, and then we're going to have to stop because we always stop promptly at 3. So you've got 4 minutes at the most to answer this one. Yes. So Rawan Alfuria, and forgive me for mispronouncing your name, says that folklorists such as Alan Dundes argue against associating oral folklore with falsehoods and unreliability. Taking that in mind, how should anthropologists adapt their research methodologies, especially when they encounter folkloric items in their fieldwork? So I guess what's behind that is partly how anthropologists can learn from folklorists, and partly the implications, if we do regard some of these as being true, then what happens to much of our conventional thinking? Yeah,
exactly. I think that one of the reasons I'm interested in this is that it challenges so much of our conventional thinking about the past, 1, and 2, it opens up potentially a whole range of sources which we could seek corroboration for, which would inform us of aspects of what, for speed, I'll call the deep past, that we never thought were accessible.
So we should get together with the folklorists?
I think you should get together with the archaeologists first of all, because that most of the absolute corroboration has come from archaeology.
Well, that's very good. Well, we're almost out of time, but you've got 2 minutes left to make a final comment, if you like.
My final comment is, I'm hoping to publish this in a suitable journal, maybe even as a book, fairly soon. So I would be very interested to know if anybody out there in the audience has any good corroborated additional examples, perhaps from parts of the world that I've not talked about, that you would let me have by email. That's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you. Wonderful book.